Right. So today's lecture is hopefully going to do two things. One is to talk about all the artists that came from Birmingham to Newlyn, because there was a very strong core of artists, all from Birmingham, who all knew each other. You met some of them last week, but I'll reintroduce you to them. And the other thing we're going to try and do is look at how the Newlyn artists depicted rural poverty, in particular the Cornish fishing industry. So, as many of you know, for centuries, Cornwall was cut off from the rest of the world. It was mainly accessible by boat, and the coastline was very treacherous. And it wasn't until the building of the Great Western Railway and Brunel's Bridge across the Tamar that accessed Cornwall for people from London and the rest of the world. And that was completed in 1859. And with it, of course, brought the artists looking for the picturesque. And this is the photo I showed you last week to introduce some of the artists. We're going to continue with some of them today, particularly the artists who came from Birmingham. So that includes Edwin Harris and William Wainwright. We're also going to look at Scott Tuke's work that he did in Newlyn, Ralph Todd and Frank Badilli, and a little bit on Frank Bramley. And then this is another photograph showing some of the other artists. That photograph is dated 1884 because Henry Scott Tuke was still there and William Wainwright was still there. By 1889, they had left. And we're going to spend quite a lot of time looking at Walter Langley's work, who was one of the first artists to come from Birmingham. Again, we've got Edwin Harris, Frank Bramley, Fortescue and Percy Craft, as well as Stanhope Forbes. So there are so many artists that came, but we're going to make a real focus on the artists from Birmingham today. And just to recap, if you remember, the last week was very much about how they all met in the ateliers in Paris and the Academy in Antwerp. But they all came to Paris at some point and were very influenced by Jules Bastien Lepage, who died in 1884, but had a huge influence, not just on the Newlyn artists, but artists who from all over the world. And then they would gravitate to the Breton coast, Pont-Aven being a popular one, where they would paint the rural Bretons in their traditional costumes. So it was inevitable that certainly the English artists, when they came back to Britain, they were looking for somewhere similar. And Stanhope Forbes described Newlyn as an English Concarneau. So he saw that direct kind of correlation between the towns in Brittany and Newlyn. And of course, Newlyn was a pretty cut-off place. It was another 1.5 miles down the road from Penzance, where the train stopped. And the census of 1881 had 6,005 people living and working in Newlyn and Mousehole. And they were completely dependent on the fishing industry. And one can't understate how dominant this was for the people of Newlyn. Everybody was involved in the Newlyn, in the fishing industry. And one thing, of course, you tend to forget is the place absolutely reeked of fish. There was a commentator who visited Newlyn at the time and was absolutely shocked and disgusted at the rotting fish and the filth in the thoroughfares. And the smells, he thought, were overwhelming, but was quite surprised how the inhabitants seemed to go around with wooden noses, ignoring it. And I suppose you do get used to it. This is an important view for you all, because this is really what Newlyn looked like, probably a bit later in 1900, but when the first artist came, it was two villages, Newlyn and Street and Noun, and the beach and the tide used to come up and cut the two villages off from each other. There was no road. The dominant boat you're going to see is the West Cornwall lugger. That's these boats here in the foreground, and they have these distinctive reddish brown sails. And they were the ones that were used to catch mackerel and herring. The main pilchard drift net season was from July to December, with herring being caught locally between October and January. The larger luggers fished for mackerel from January to June before sailing for the Irish Sea in search of the migrating herring stocks. They then crossed over to the North Sea and sailed down the east coast of England all the way around, and would be not coming back until September. Pilchards were caught using the seine boats, which you're going to see in quite a few of the paintings. These were rowing boats, 6 to 8 rowers in a boat, and they worked in groups of 3. Seining mainly happened in St Ives, but there were seine boats in Newlyn and Mousehole. So while in Mounts Bay it was mainly mackerel which dominated as the pilchard numbers declined. And of course, it meant the drift net fishermen were away for months sometimes at a time. As one commentator said, it made the fishermen, the Cornish fishermen, as hard as their native granite. Now, I emailed you this map. Some of you printed it off. It's from my good friend Joanna Mattingly's book on Mousehole and Newlyn. It's a social history book. Sadly, it's out of print now. But it just gives you an idea of the kind of environment, and I've edited it with where artists live. But just to say, the original quay, which was medieval, is this tiny little quay here, which if you see on the television programme, is when it flies over the drone, you just see this sort of grass-covered quay, which is sadly neglected. And then in 1885 to 6, they built the South Pier, which is the one with the light on the end of it. And then it wasn't until 1891 that they started the North Pier, got as far as here, and then they extended it in 1894. So that's why you have this tiny gap for the boats to go in and out of. And it really sheltered the whole of the bay for the fishing fleet. And as I said, this was the village of Street and Noun, and this is Newlyn. And in the paintings that you're going to see, most of them were done before the North Pier was built. And this is the road that was built not until 1908. So in the 1880s, when the tide came in, if you wanted to get from one side of the Street and Noun to Newlyn, you had to climb the hill, Chine Hill, and come down the other side. So it was a very isolated place. And just some of the artists we're going to look at today as to where they lived. So Walter Langley, who ended up in Penzance, but he first started out in Pembroke Lodge, which is down here, from 1882 to 92. And then his friend William Wainwright and Edwin Harris, who were both from Birmingham, lived at Cliff Cottage, Castle Cottage. Then we have Bateman's Meadow, which is very crucial to where a lot of the artists later had glass houses, which they used as studios, and where Stanhope Forbes had his studio built, which became the home of the Forbes School of Painting. We've got Mrs. Madden's boarding house, which is at Bellevue, and many of the artists stayed there, including Bourdillon, Badilly, and Stanhope Forbes and Chevalier Taylor. And the Malt House was the home to the Gotches for a while, and before they moved to Wheel Betsy, which was their house they had built. And I'm hoping we'll have time to just look at Newlyn Copper at the end. And this was the home of Newlyn Copper, which it still is in Newlyn. And this is a photograph to show you Champion Slip. So this is before the road was built in 1908, connecting the two villages and the beach where Fish Sail on Cornish Beach was painted and all the boats were moored. Now, I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on Walter Langley because I feel he was much neglected for many years, mainly, of course, because he worked in watercolour. And there was a great deal of snobbery, still is, if you're an artist, about people who work in watercolour, because it was seen as the art of the amateur. But I can assure you there's nothing amateur about Walter Langley's watercolours. So born in Birmingham in 1852, his father was a tailor, and he was one of 11 children, and he grew up in a very poor slum part of the inner city of Birmingham. At the age of 15, he was an apprentice to a lithographer. For 6 years, he then worked his way up to, he managed to get a scholarship to go to South Kensington to study design. And he returned to Birmingham to become a partner in the firm of lithographers. But his real passion was painting, and he signed up for evening classes at the Royal Society of Birmingham Artists. So he didn't become a professional painter until he was 27, and in 1879. By this time, he'd married Clara Perkins, and he'd had 2 children by then. So he came to Newlyn on holiday in 1880, and then in 1891. And then, if you remember from last week, he went to Pont-Aven in Brittany in 1882, where he drew and painted a lot of the local people in traditional costume. So he then was able to move to Cornwall in March 1882 because he was offered £500 from his agent J.W. Thrupp for a year's work, which is roughly £33,000 in today's money. And he's also commissioned to do 20 paintings from his Birmingham dealer, Edwin Chamberlain. And I'm going to start by kind of show you Langley's technique. These are some drawings we discussed last week of how, because he worked in watercolour, Langley prepared in black and white, and he did hundreds of charcoal drawings. And this drawing on the right shows a grid on it, and it's what we call squaring up. And he would usually do the drawing to the scale, the same size as the finished picture, but sometimes if it was smaller, he would scale it up so you could work out what was supposed to be in each square. And this is the final picture. Now, I've put the measurements on these because if you haven't seen a Langley watercolour, they are not small. This is nearly just over 3 foot high by nearly 2 foot. So they're big watercolours. And although he probably did all these drawings, particularly of the steps in situ, he would paint indoors for his models. And the skill he developed was how to make them look a bit more naturally placed. I always find she's a bit cut out in this picture. And of course, that was a skill that he developed and became very good at. And this is one of his early great successes, which is called Time Moveth Not, Our Being 'Tis That Moves. And it was painted in 1882 in Newlyn. And it's an example of several of Langley's paintings where he chose a line from a poem to be the title of his picture to add weight to what he was trying to say. So this is from a poem called Time by Henry Kurt White. The poem is over 30 verses long. You'll be pleased to know I ain't going to read it all. But it's a poem about memory and how the illusion of time looks like it's standing still. And the stanza that he's chosen is time moveth not our being, 'tis that moves. And we swift gliding down life's rapid stream, dream of swift ages and revolving years, ordained to chronicle our passing days. So the young sailor in the gallant bark, scudding before the wind, beholds the coast receding from his eyes, and think the while, struck with amaze, that he is motionless and that the land is sailing. And I included that bit because, of course, it's painted in Cornwall. What I want you to look at is the drama of the lighting in this picture. Can you see how the light comes down from above and hits her forehead, emphasizing the furrows in her brow? And her hand is spotlit, and then the shoes that look very worn are also spotlit. So it's a very dramatic pose. And I just, again, want to show you that, of course, he repeated this pose many times, but he didn't always have it with the same dramatic effect. So here we have Grace again, almost the same, isn't she? And this is just called A Quiet Afternoon. So can you see the difference between the drama of this painting and the added power of having that title, And then also the fact that it's a subject he knew really well. And this is a much more sort of easy, passive kind of painting. So, you know, these weren't just one-offs. There was a lot of trial and error in what he was doing. And here we have But Men Must Work and Women Must Weep, which is a very well-known picture, especially in Birmingham. And this again was taken from a poem, this time by Charles Kingsley, called The Three Fishers. Three fishers went sailing away to the west as the sun went down. Each thought on the woman who loved him best, and the children stood watching them out of town. For men must work and women must weep, and there's little to earn and many to keep, though the harbour bar be moaning. So it adds quite a lot, doesn't it, to the image, and when you're looking at it, to sort of hear that poem in your head. And although watercolours do fade over time because of UV light, unfortunately, Langley deliberately painted his models in faded clothes. And he made his studio up to look like a fisherman's cottage. So I hate to say it, but these pictures they are contrived, they are composed. I had one lady who came on my course at Milo once, who was an artist, who was so upset that to find that Langley didn't just paint people as he saw them and they just sat down. And they're deliberate. It's all very deliberate, the way the light's hitting her face. And of course, it's all about loss of loved ones, particularly the fishermen at sea, and the knife-edge existence that these women particularly lived, and the families that depended on the fishermen. And this is where Langley was very much had a social message. Out of all of the artists, he was one who related to Lepage's social realism and socialism in his paintings. And he had tremendous success with these watercolours. This is another one that deals with the same subject, Among the Missing, seen in a Cornish fishing village. If you live in Cornwall and go to Penlee a lot, you'll know it well. It's a huge picture, getting over 3 foot high. And this is telling of the tragic news that's come in of a boat missing at sea, using the relatively modern technology of a telegraph. Can you see the telegraph pole attached to the post office? And it's a very clever figure composition. Langley was superb in being able to lead your eye around a picture. Can you just see how the telegraph wire comes down at a diagonal across the picture? And then it leads your eye down to this group. Then the oar the fisherman's carrying leads you to this group. And once again, Langley was displayed or made a point of showing almost the full life cycle, particularly of girls to women, to mothers in Newlyn. So you've got babe in arms, little girl clinging on to skirts, and then young wife being consoled by a much older woman. So it's got a real sense of community, hasn't it, this painting? And Langley was, like most of the artists, I mean, initially, before they had studios built, they rented the fishermen's net lofts and they rented their cottages to paint their pictures in. So there was, and of course, they paid them as models as well. Just a little technical thing for those of you who haven't seen this in real life, you can't see it on the slide, but he actually added 6 inches onto this picture, and it's glued on down, stripped down the side to make it wider. So he had no qualms, did Langley, about adding to the width of his paper in order to get a better composition. Rowan, do you mind switching your photo off? It's a bit distracting. This is the house that he rented, and this is his studio on the right-hand side. You can see the skylights to one side and the roof. This is at the Fradgen, and this is again shows you where the tide would have come all the way up to the houses before the road was built. So this painting, Amongst the Missing, was a very successful painting for Langley. He sold it for £420 in 1884 to a Manchester businessman, and that was around £27,800 in today's money. So his watercolours brought him financial success. He favoured long, narrow compositions sometimes. This is called Waiting for the Boats. Again, you've got all the generations of young women waiting for the boats to come back from their fishing trip. And you've got the young ones looking out to sea, being optimistic, maybe reading a letter. The ones who know it's going to be a long wait have bought their knitting. And then you've got the older ones who are looking not out to sea because they know that the outcome could be that they don't return. But it's a series of portraits, isn't it? And this is another long, narrow composition that Langley used, called In a Cornish Fishing Village, Departure of the Fleet to the North. And this is on the old quay that I showed you, looking across to Newlyn, and you can see them looking out to the fleet out on the horizon. And again, it shows you those who are left behind, the young women who's carrying the cows, which will be used to fill the fish when they land the fish, and young girl being talked to by older woman. For those of you who are interested, these are pressing stones, and these are pressing rods that were used to press the pilchards in their houses. This is like a weight that was hung from these poles. So these brought Langley tremendous success in terms of financial success. But even though he sold these pictures for, like I say, a decent amount of money, he still felt that his earnings in 1885 of £797 was a bit precarious for a father of a growing family. So he decided to go back to Birmingham in 1885 for 2 years. And he painted this picture called Betrayed, which again deals with the slightly, controversial subject of possibly an unwanted child. And his other paintings were of factory workers and forge workers in Birmingham. Now, I think he realised it was a bit of a mistake, because a lot of his patrons and purchasers of his pictures were factory and forge owners. And they didn't mind rural poverty, such as Newlyn fisherfolk, because it was remote, comfortably remote. And whereas the urban poverty of their own employees was a bit too close to home. So there was a pressure on Langley to go back to Newlyn and produce more watercolours. The other thing was that he wanted to paint more in oils, but they didn't want him to do that. They wanted him to paint in watercolour. So that's why he stuck to watercolour, because he had a market for it. So he came back to Newlyn in 1887, 88, and did paintings like this, which again uses a poem, this time by Tennyson, called Break, Break, Break. I'll read you the stanza. Break, break, break on my cold grey stones, O sea, and I would that my tongue could utter the thoughts that arise in me. Oh, well for the fisherman's boy that he shouts with his sister at play. Oh, well for the sailor lad that he sings in his boat on the bay. And the stately ships go on to their haven under the hill. But oh, for the touch of a vanished hand and the sound of a voice that is still. So it's very haunting, some of the poems that he uses to accompany his paintings. And this is another use of Shakespeare this time, from Much Ado About Nothing, Balthasar's Song, Act 2, Scene 3, where Balthasar is called Jilted, the fraud of men was ever so since summer first saw. And it's where Balthasar warns that men are fundamentally devious creatures. I couldn't possibly comment. 1 foot in sea and 1 on shore, to one thing constant never. And of course must have been particularly relevant to the wives and sweethearts of Newlyn fishermen, who went off quite a lot for several months a year. And we've got a reference to the play in the print on the wall. But this beautiful painting, again, of a very soft off-white dress against a white wall. And just to remind you, for those of you who don't paint watercolour, in watercolour the white comes from the white of the paper. So that hence why he did so many black and white drawings, to work out where the dark and lights were. And if he did go wrong, he very rarely used what we call body colour or Chinese white to add a highlight. If anything, he used to scrape it through the paper. Children were a constant subject for Langley. He had 4 in the end, but he used local children as his models. He paid them just like he'd done in Brittany. And this is a little girl. I love the way she's holding a stack of his watercolours. And this is a little boy, a fisherman's son from 1884, holding the little model boat in his hand. So this is an example of a study that's the same size as the final picture, called The Orphan. And if I show you the final painting, can you see how he's worked out, again, where the darks and light in the picture are in the charcoal drawing first? And he's added to it with maybe a mat on the floor and more detail and dark underneath the table. So these took a long time, had to be very carefully done, and they were very considered paintings. Like I say, he did try oil painting as early as 1885, and I think he was just as competent in oils as he was in watercolour. And this is painted at Pembroke Lodge in the garden with his neighbour, William Curnow, and he's was an enthusiast and expert on mosses, and he even had a moss named after him called Physidens coronovi. But it shows Langley's interest in Japanese art. Again, we've got, instead of a long, narrow composition, we've got a tall, narrow composition, emphasised by the tree and the blossom, and painted on a bright, sunny day. So very dramatic lighting. But like I say, it wasn't until later on, this is a study of old William, which I think is marvellous. Shows you that people lost their teeth in those days. And this is another black and white drawing, which is a study for, again, a very successful watercolour called Missing, or Disaster in a Cornish fishing village. His black and white drawings were very popular commercially. And I think you can see in some ways they've got far more kind of vigour and life in them, haven't they? Because he's not hindered by having to be careful. He could rub out areas with an eraser. And you get the real sense of the drama of the sea crashing over the wall there, and the cry for help, and the little girl hiding in her mother's skirts. The final painting is marvellous, but it's got a bit more, it's a bit more static, isn't it? But these paintings, although he was never became an associate of the Royal Academy or anything like that, that his colleagues Bramley and Stanhope Forbes would be, his watercolours were recognised abroad, and he won a gold medal at the Paris Universal Exhibition in 1889 for Among the Missing and this painting and another. He also won a gold medal at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 as well. So sadly, he wasn't so well recognised in this country as he was abroad. I've just put this in because I just think it's a gorgeous picture of a little girl knitting, and it's the sensitivity of the way he's painted her hair and a hole in her dress, and the detail of the dahlia and looking out across to the village. Sadly, he had to cope with the tragedy of his first wife, Clara, dying in 1895. She died of TB. No, she didn't. She died of a stroke, sorry, very suddenly. And it left Langley a widower with 4 children to bring up. And he did start to paint in oil from that period onward, interestingly. And so his watercolours then became studied for his major oil paintings. So this is Breadwinners, which is quite late, it's 1896. So there's a bit of artistic license here because, of course, the North Pier was built by then. So but he's decided not to put it in the picture. And this is after a fish sales happened on the beach. The Cornish luggers are out in the water. And the jousters, which was their job, was to pick up the fish and carry it in their cows to the local villages and sell it and distribute it. And they'd be carrying up to 40 pounds of salt as well. And this is the final oil painting that was a study for, which is in a private collection. So Langley had tremendous empathy for the women in Newlyn and their roles and the work that they did. He finally got acknowledged for his oil paintings in 1897 when he was invited to submit a self-portrait to the prestigious Uffizi Gallery in Florence, which has got the biggest collection of artist self-portraits in the world. And he chose Newlyn as the backdrop for his self-portrait. So he married again to a local lass, and she was called Ethel Pengelly, and they moved to Penzance. She was the first cousin of Harold Harvey, who was another Cornish painter, and he kind of eased off after that. He still did these very powerful paintings, which were recognised internationally. This is a quote from Pope's essay on man, and Tolstoy thought this was a great example of good art in his essay on what is art. So a bit like Bastien Lepage, if you remember, the Russians rated Lepage's work because they understood the socialist content of his work, and the Russians felt the same about Walter Langley as well. And this is probably one of his most powerful later oil paintings of 1898, repeating the theme that he introduced in so many of his watercolours, but now was able to show in his oil paintings. And this is another quote from a Tennyson poem called Memoriam, which is all about loss. So bereavement and loss was a constant theme in Langley's work. And it was something he continued throughout his career. But as I say, from about 1900 to just before he died in 1920, his work for me became a kind of pastiche of what his earlier paintings had been. And they become very sweet and somewhat saccharine and much more kind of cute and more commercial, if you like. But that's just my opinion. You can disagree with me in the break. And just to briefly mention that because Langley was so late in putting his subject of grief and loss into oil painting, he was sort of usurped by Frank Bramley, who produced this painting in 1888 called A Hopeless Dawn. And this was shown in the Royal Academy in London, and it was bought for the nation and hangs in the Tate. And we'll go into it in much more detail next week, because it was the beginning of the Newlyn School being recognised and becoming this famous school of art. But it's a great tragedy that, for me, that Langley was never recognised in the same way Bramley was, simply because he painted in watercolour. And we mentioned last week briefly photography, and how in some ways we understand photography to equal realism in today's language. And certainly this is a photograph of a Penzance fishwife from the time. There's no kind of romanticisation there, is there? And it's quite brutal. And I think most of the artists, because of the fact they were trained as plein air painters, didn't use photographs to paint from like they do today, but that they were certainly a way of recording maybe a certain dress or a style and a pose, especially if an older woman was having to hold that pose. So it was a way of just recording things. But I suppose when you compare it with the artist depictions of exactly the same subject, this is by William Banks Fortescue, who was another Birmingham artist, it does look romantic, doesn't it? It's painted in this soft, gentle way, and the little boy carrying his toy boat, it kind of softens the whole subject matter and makes it less grim, if you like. So Fortescue began his career as an engineering designer before setting out to train as an artist. He studied in Paris, went to Europe, went to Venice, and then began exhibiting at the Royal Birmingham Society of Artists. He arrived in Newlyn in 1885, staying at Mrs. Madden's house in Bellevue with Stanhope Forbes. And this is one of the many cartoons of the artist by Fred Hall, where he picks up on their characteristics. So Fortescue played the cello, he was a painter, and he also was a clog dancer, the same as Walter Langley. And when they had their evenings of music and theatrical performances that the Newlyn artists got together to do, Fortescue was one of the star turns. Now he appears to be a resident in Newlyn right up until 1891. And this is him painting another aspect of fishing, which is shrimp net fishing. And this is them wading out in their bare feet on the sands to catch the shrimp. And this is one that people possibly know best by him, which is in Penlee's collection of the old slip coming down to the quay. So this was your way around. If the tide was in, you came up the hill and back down. And thankfully, these railings are still there. They've sort of been listed now. And he moved to St Ives, or he moved to Paul first for a few years and then St Ives. He wasn't as prolific as many of the other Birmingham artists. And he died in St Ives in 1924 and is buried in Zena. Another Birmingham artist that we've mentioned already is William Wainwright. He had inherited wealth from a family. His father did designs for the Royal Mint, but then his father lost it all. And he died at the age of 37, leaving a widow and 2 sons, including Wainwright. And he started a 7-year indenture to become a draftsman in a stained glass window designers. And he remained for 4 years before he went to Verlat's Academy, as we saw last week, in Antwerp. And it was Verlat who said to stick to watercolours. He said it would be better to be first class in that than second in oil painting. And I showed you some of his oil paintings, and I disagreed with Verlat. But Wainwright came to Newlyn after living in Paris, and he didn't stay long. He mainly did portraits. This is an old salt who appears in a lot of the pictures. You'll see how the artist started to share the models, and it's just a wonderful painting showing all the details of the creases in his forehead and the knit of his jumper. And he appears in quite a few paintings, not just by Wainwright, but by other artists. And this is another big watercolour done by Wainwright of them spotting the mackerel in the bay. So unlike today, where you send the boat out and you press sonar and it finds the shoals of fish for you, you had to climb a hill or a tower and look out to see where you could see the shoals of fish. And then you could signal to the boats, the same boats, and they could set off to catch them. Wainwright did a lot of black and white work like Langley, but he used a thing called sepia and sepia ink and watercolour. And it's made from beetles' wings. It sort of gives a kind of shellac-like quality to the picture. And this is an old model that was used by a lot of the Birmingham artists. And Wainwright in the end damaged his eyesight from painting watercolours outside from the glare of the paper. That's what he said he did anyway. And he went back to Birmingham and mainly painted historical drama portraits, which will feature in the plays, poems and fairy tale section. Then we come to Edwin Harris. He was exceptional in the Newlyners in that he mainly did portraits. I think he was a stunning portrait painter myself. He didn't depict the harsh realities of fishing life in Newlyn. He tended to focus on children and young women and domestic scenes. Excuse me. He was studied at Birmingham School of Art along with Walter Langley and William Breakspeare when he was just 14 years old. He won prizes there and was invited to teach in 1873, and he taught for 2 years there. He then set up his own studio in Edgbaston and taught privately. He then shared studios with Walter Langley in various studios around Birmingham. And it was the establishment of the Birmingham Art Circle, which was a club for the young artists that was run by the dealer Edwin Chamberlain, that really set Harris' career off, because he started to sell his work there. So after he went to Antwerp, he came back to Birmingham, then went to Pont-Aven in Dinan, in Brittany, and as well, where he probably did this picture of a Breton farmer. And he ran out of money in Brittany, and that's when he had to start painting portraits to pay the bills. And he would do 2 sittings per model of 2 hours duration at a very modest fee of some 25 francs per head. And this kind of set the standard for Harris, because he would then become what I'd say a jobbing portrait painter for the rest of his life, which is, he was still very good at it, but it didn't get him the acclaim of the other artists. He happened to marry the dealer Edwin Chamberlain's niece, Sally Chamberlain, in 1882, and they came and settled in Newlyn in 1883, renting Cliff Castle House, and their son Guy was born in 1884. And he's did a lot of early paintings in Newlyn from about 1882 to 1895. This is one called Under the Cliffs, and features a young girl who he then, of course, they all did studies of their figures and their more complex figure composition. But again, I just think it shows Harris's skill as a portrait painter. I found this one the other day, and it's just called A Bearded Fisherman, and it's not very big, as you can see, but I just think it's a cracking picture. And that thing of how, you know, if you draw a line down your face, that both sides of your face are different, aren't they? So sadly, mine's getting more and more exaggerated as I get older, and that sort of droop in his eyelid compared to his other eye. I just think it's amazing painting, again using a square brush technique. And here's our old salt again, who was painted by Wainwright and Langley, and painted by Edwin Harris here as well. And this is the other old boy that was painted with the long beard by William Wainwright. But he did do more complex figure compositions. This is called refitting, again of a little boy holding a model boat, and he's refitting, putting a new mast on it. I loved all the little shavings that you can see around the painting and where he's sitting on the fisherman's sails. He did paint outdoors. And, by the way, Edwin Harris only painted in oils. He didn't paint in watercolour. And this was a popular theme with Newlyn artists, was painting young people in orchards, in apple orchards. But his favourite model was Kate Jeffries, who I introduced last week, who Bramley painted a lot. She had this wonderful black hair. And this is called Love Letters or Autumn Leaves. And it's very typical of a lot of Edwin Harris's interior work, of young women and older women inside. And this is a popular one in Penley's collection of Kate, again, called The Lesson. And this challenge the artists set themselves of painting these off-white dresses against white walls. Can you just see the sort of slight pink he's used in the girl's dress? And just to show you how it was always, if it possible, you could share your models with your artist friends. This is exactly the same composition, but by Norman Garstin, the Irish painter. So you can almost imagine Edwin Harris sitting on one side painting this picture from this angle, and Norman Garstin painting it further round. So it's an example of how they doubled up with their models. This is called The Limpet Gatherer. So he did do more paintings of young ladies outdoors. I think she's rather well dressed to pick limpets. if you ask me. But she is a tiny little waist, and the sort of calm that's in Edwin Harris's work, I think I like the best. So his ambition was to become a member of the Royal Birmingham Society of Artists, because Langley and Wainwright had been elected as well. And he finally achieved that in 1887. Sadly, his first wife died in 1887 at the age of 25 of TB, and he moved from Newlyn to Streatham Nowen. But he continued to paint in Newlyn for a few years more. Like I say, mainly interiors. This is an old fishwife taking a pinch of snuff, which was a popular thing to do. And he married again in 1896, and this is called a Valentine. So this was probably when he was courting his second wife, who was also called Sarah Chamberlain Cornwell. And they had a daughter called Dorothy. They moved to South Wales, where he continued to portrait paintings, and finally came back to Birmingham. But sadly, by this time in 1894, his Edwin Chamberlain, the dealer, died, and really sales dried up for Edwin Harris. And his wife, by 1903, had to go to London with their daughter to work as a washer and maid. And Edwin Harris died on his own in 1905 at just the age of 51. So not a happy story, but these paintings were done in Birmingham, and he was still painting Newlyn subjects. Okay, I'm going to have to speed up now. Still on Birmingham, this is Frank Richards. Frank was another product of the Birmingham School of Art, and he remained in Birmingham until 1883, went to Europe and North Africa, and then came to Lulworth in Dorset first, before finally coming to Newlyn in 1887, and sorry, by 1890. And this is very unusual, kind of brightly lit interior of a fisherman by Frank Richards. And you've got all the paraphernalia of fishing life with the nets and floats, and very brightly lit painting. But he was mainly an impressionist, was Frank Richards. And he wrote an article in 1893, which was published in the Studio, called Newlyn as a Sketching Ground, and we'll go into that in more detail next week. I found this interesting painting by him recently on the internet of a sort of rural view, but this cross is a bit of a giveaway, and I've worked out his Beskenna cross, which those of you who know that part of the back of Newlyn on the way to Lamorna is, and that cross is still there on the road. But the person, of course, who's got to grips with, so we've done Birmingham, we're now doing other artists who included the fishing industry in their paintings. I might have to go over a bit in time, I'm afraid. Is Stanhope Forbes, famous for his plein air paintings, came to Newlyn from Brittany, and the first year he was there, he started this picture called A Fish Sail on Cornish Beach. We will go into it in more detail about why it was seen as so important next week. But just to say, it took him nearly a year to paint. It was painted deliberately on a grey day, and we've got the West Cornwall luggers out at sea here, bringing the catch in and having the fish sail on the beach. And a bit like, if you remember his picture of the farmyard in Brittany, of the chickens, I pointed out to you how he uses white in a painting to lead your eye through it. And can you see how he uses the white of the skate and the white of the pinafores of the women to sort of lead your eye around the picture? Like Lepage, he was very interested in using different perspectives. He's deliberately raised the horizon line of the sea in this painting than it actually would be if you were using an accurate perspective, so it slightly tips up. And this brings the characters in the foreground into the sort of sharp focus as dominating the canvas. He always paid for his models, including his fish. Famously, he paid 9p for the 3 huge skate, and another day he paid 4 shillings for a turbot for an hour. Don't think I would have liked to eat that turbot after that. But he was very exact in his detail in his painting. So he nearly gave up on this picture. He moaned about the fact that his models, actually, one of the female model fainted. How dare she? And the wind and rain blew his easel over. And he wrote all this to his mother. He was very good at moaning to his mother. But it became, he did finish it, and it was shown at the Royal Academy in 1885. But it wasn't bought by the Chantry Bequest for the Nation. And we'll find out why next week. The following year, he produced this picture, Off to the Fishing Ground, again involving the Cornish fishing industry. This time you're actually on the boat. But it's an interesting perspective again, because you're seeing the horizon and seeing the bottom of the boat at the same time. And the critics didn't like this. They thought he was taking the mickey, but he didn't care because he sold it to the Walker Art Gallery anyway. Fishing was a theme he used right through into the 1900s. This is about 1903, this picture. And this is the men sitting in the seine net. But it's a series of portraits, really, isn't it? So this is the seine net on the boat, looking for the shoals of mackerel and pilchards. And then 1902, he's doing this painting called Chadding in Mounts Bay, and of the kids line fishing. This is the Chadding is the name of the fish. You can just see St Michael's Mount in the background. But can you see how he's really made the subject the reflection of the boat in the water, which became certainly his kind of focus in his work. Then we have other artists who came to Newlyn. Thomas Cooper Gotch, who came from Kettering and went to the Slade, where he met Tuke, and Antwerp. When he arrived in Newlyn, Stanhope Forbes described him as a weak sort of creature and compared him to an unmade bed. But he later, with his wife Caroline, Forbes much admired Gotch, particularly for his and his wife's theatrical achievements in their amateur dramatics. And this is a watercolour by Gotch showing another aspect of fishing in Newlyn, where the families shared out the catch, and then they ask a stranger to check that they've done it in a fair way. And this is a study for this oil painting called Sharing Fish. He also produced this picture called Mental Arithmetic, and it's of a fisherman drinking tea out of a very fine bone china cup and saucer, and a lovely example of chinoiserie in the jug. Now, I used to joke about this, saying how unlikely it was, but one of my students pointed out that the fishermen, when they used to go as far as Holland, would pick up china as ballast in their boats. And I think it was one of the Belitho families moaned that Newlyn fishwives had better bone china collections than she did. But it still seems incongruous to me that a burly fisherman would be drinking tea out of a bone china cup. Anyway, and this is another painting I found by Gotch that's in the Kreiser collection in America. Can you see the storm that's happening out at sea? And then the fisherman telling the family of what's going on. Gotch was again to reject all this and become much more interested in symbolist painting after his trip to Italy. Henry Scott Tuke, who we've seen before, met all his friends in Paris and at the Slade, and he came to Newlyn on the death of his brother of TB in 1883. And he only stayed a couple of months initially, but he managed to find accommodation in this chap's cellar, Philip Harvey. And he did this rather interesting pastel, which is in the Polly's collection, of Philip barking nets. And barking meant that the nets were being preserved against assault from the sea. And they used a bark from a tree called gumcutch, and it stank. But that's what's going on in this picture. But Tuke did several paintings in Harvey's fish cellars, and this is a study of Sarah Ann Stevenson for this painting called Shipbuilders, looking at a little boy's rather good model boat in the basement. And like so many of the Newlyn interiors, it's just lit with one light source from a window, and you just get a hint of like the fish hanging up and all the paraphernalia on the roof. And this is his other famous painting he did in Harvey's net loft of a local lad called Ambrose Ruffignac. And these two paintings were shown in London and bought by his dealer Dowd as well, and set him on his way as being a successful artist. But he didn't decide to leave Newlyn and went to Falmouth in 1885, and we'll see what he did there next week. Another lesser known artist is Ralph Todd, who met Forbes in Campbell in 1882 and then came to Newlyn. Forbes wasn't very nice about him, even though he was a friend. He said that Todd had no art in him, and were he to paint forever, he would do no good work. Who needs friends like that, eh? And sure, some of his pictures, like this one in Churrow's collection, the figures are quite wooden compared to Walter Langley, and he shared a studio with Langley and learnt a lot. But I worked in commercial gallery for 9.5 years, and I learned that you can see sometimes a lot better pictures in commercial world than you can in museums, ironically. And this is one of his watercolours called Tough Work, and I just love the detail in the hands. Another great watercolour artist was Henry Meynell Rheam. He came from Birkenhead, studied in Germany and at Heatherley's in London and Julien's Academy in Paris. He came to Newlyn from Paul Perrot in 1890 to make up the artists' cricket team. Get your priorities right. He was Henry Scott Tuke's first cousin on his mother's side. And this again is a big watercolour leaning on the railings on the seafront, and you just see the slip going down to the old quay in the background. I love this later watercolour of them gathering the nets in with the fish, which again, if you saw the contemporary fishing boats, they just press a button, don't they? And a big engine brings the nets in. Had to do it all by hand in those days. And then this is a later watercolour by him of, I think, amazing painting of oilskins of a local fisherman. And you've just got the Newlyn light in the background. And then Frank Badilli, who was our only Cornishman in the group, who didn't stay long. He was born in Penzance, and he actually stayed at Mrs. Madden's in Bellevue, but he only stayed for about 2 years because he went to study law in London, and then left Cornwall and joined the civil service in India and worked as the part of the colonial service. And this is one of a few paintings by him in a public collection called Mending Father's Nets. But somebody who painted two of the most relevant paintings to the Cornish fishing industry are by Percy Craft. Percy was from Kent, and he had studied art at Heatherley's, but he also was a trained actor, and he set up the Newlyn Amateur Dramatic Society. But he painted two really big paintings. This one was painted in St Ives, and it's called Heather Heather, and it's the cry of the fishermen once they've spotted the shoals of fish. The fishing law was that you couldn't shoot your nets before the fishing boats were at least 3 miles offshore, and the cry shouted through the metal trumpet was to alert the seiners that the shoal of fish had been spotted. So very much a sort of a part of life in St Ives, but of course also in Newlyn and Mounts Bay. And this is quite an interesting painting. This is them actually catching the pilchards with these same boats. Can you see the angle of the boat tipped up, full of fish? And it's also seen as quite important because it shows some of the so-called heroes of the Newlyn fishing riots, which took place on the 18th of May 1896 with Lowestoft fishermen. Now, they had come down and fished off the coast of Newlyn on the Sabbath, and most fishermen in Newlyn, of course, were Methodists and they didn't work on the Sabbath. But even more so was the fact that the Lowestoft men, if they landed their catch on the Monday, they would glut the market. So the Newlyn fishermen walked down to the quay on Sunday and emptied their catch of 100,000 mackerel into the sea. A fight ensued. The local constabulary could not cope. So they ordered 300 soldiers arrived on the Monday and 3 gunboats. Slight overreaction. A riot ensued for a week because the Newlyn fishermen had been joined by Penzance, Mousel and Portleven fishermen. 6 men were found guilty and were bound over to keep the peace for a year. And several of these portraits are seen as some of the heroes of that riot. So it gives you an idea of the relationship between the fishermen and the artists and the respect people like Percy Craft had for them. I've run out of time, but I'll just give you a couple of minutes on the Newlyn copper, because Newlyn copper is very much kind of parallel with the decline of the fishing industry. It came about because young people, in particularly in the winter months, were unemployed. So the Newlyn industrial class, or what became known as the Newlyn metal industry, was founded. It was helped by Thomas Bolitho donating this building for its usage, and that was part of the Technical Instruction Act of 1889, which put the responsibility of training young people at the door of the newly formed county councils. It also was combined with a thing called the Home Art and Industries Association, which was a nationwide organisation which again encouraged teaching young people developing handicrafts to earn money. And this is famous painting by Forbes of the main teacher they had at the school, which was John Douglas Mackenzie. And he taught the classes with John Payne Cotton. And here he is, John Payne Cotton, when he's about 13 years old. And if you don't know, Newlyn copper is repose work, which means you're hitting the metal from behind. And this is the charger that's in that painting by Forbes that Mackenzie designed and a chap called Philip Hodder made. And they made all sorts of things. The height of the popularity of Newlyn copper was in about 1908. And you could buy everything, as you can see here, including candlesticks. And you could have the cheap version for 4 shillings and 6pence, or the deluxe version for 9 shillings. And these are collectible items now worth hundreds of pounds all over the world. So sorry, I only just fitted that in, but I hope that's given you a bit of an idea of what it's all about. Okay,